All right. Hello and welcome to Politics and Prose bookstore. My name is Ramsey. I'm a bookseller here where we host in-person events along with partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. When we get to the time for opening the floor to your questions, we place a standing microphone at the end of the aisle in front of the white column facing me. Please line up at the mic so that everyone can hear your question, as we want that question to be heard in a recording of the event. We ask that you keep your questions a question, to keep things timely and allow others time to ask their respective questions. Following the Q&A, we'll have a setting up here at this table. So if you have not already purchased the book, we have many copies behind a register at the front of the store. We will ask you to line up behind the mic stand, where event staffers will come by to ask you for your name for personalizations, so please have your books ready for us. It's been 2 years, 4 months, 1 week, and 4 days since the Israeli government decided to carry out the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Palestinians like myself have known about the atrocities happening in Palestine ever since our grandparents sat us down and told us the stories of the displacement, accompanied by pictures and historic materials they were able to keep to show proof of their lives they once lived in Palestine before the Nakba. Despite Palestinian writers, activists, academics, and writers pleading to the world for some type of material change in Palestine, it never came. Then, October 7th, 2023 happened, forever changing Israel's public image as a beacon of alleged Western values, but a government fueled by ambitions of ethnic cleansing and regional expansion by any means. But why? Why Gaza? Why Palestine? How did we get to the Gaza Health Ministry report of 75,000 killed Palestinians, 90% of the population in Gaza displaced, and approximately 2/3 of structures destroyed or damaged? Julia Norman and Maia Carter Hallward provide these answers in this book. By combining interviews of Palestinians from Gaza and laying out the rich history of the region that goes even further back than the 1936-1939 revolt in Palestine, they set the stage for readers to have the proper context accompanied by personal Palestinian accounts of these historical events. So without further ado, today I'm very excited to welcome Julia M. Norman, co-author of Gaza, The Dream and the Nightmare. Dr. Norman is an associate professor in politics and international relations at University College London and a researcher consultant on conflict, peace building, and political violence. An expert on the Middle East and foreign policy, she's a frequent commentator on the BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, Bloomberg, and other media outlets. She's the author of 6 books, including tonight's book on Gaza. Norman will be joined in conversation with Pam Bailey, a social justice activist and journalist based in Washington, D.C. She lived and worked in Gaza Strip following the 2008-2009 Israeli assault and co-founded We Are Not Numbers in 2015. Today, in addition to her ongoing support of the Palestinian cause, she serves as the co-founder and managing director of a nonprofit that advocates for currently and formerly incarcerated D.C. residents called More Than Our Crimes. With that said, please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Pam Bailey and Julia Norman.
Is it on? Yeah. Okay. So, welcome everybody. The other thing that they didn't mention is there's also a book called We Are Not Numbers that just came out that I was the editor for. I say editor because we compiled stories. The project that I founded there in Gaza was designed to help young people there, tell their own personal narratives. And there's a collection of personal narratives over 10 years. And one of the things that was the purpose of my book was to share the good stories too that people never hear. They hear about, and that's what I think what really resonated in the title of the book that we're talking about tonight, The Dream and the Nightmare, is that people only think about Gaza as a nightmare. And yet, when I was living there, even though there was war all the time, I loved it. It is so dear to my heart. And so I want to ask you about your title. I mean, was that and it comes from a quote that she gives in the very beginning of the book from somebody, and maybe you can read the whole quote, but one of the Gazans she talked to describe Gaza as a dream and a nightmare. I'm just wondering, when you first thought about writing this book, was that your intention to tease out both parts, or did that inspiration for that theme come from that interview?
Great. Well, thank you, Pam, and thank you, Ramsey. Thank you all for being here tonight and joining us for the conversation. Yeah, I mean, for those of you who haven't seen the book yet, the subtitle is "The Dream and the Nightmare," and that was very intentional. The book is partly a history, but also it's inclusive of many different Gazans' voices from different periods of time in Gaza's history. And so we did numerous interviews with Gazans from different walks of life. And in one of these conversations, our interlocutor used this phrase just completely unprompted and said, living in Gaza was like a dream and a nightmare at the same time. And he was the one who used those specific terms, but almost to a person, Pam, almost everyone we spoke to spoke of Gaza somehow in this way. Some referred to it as a heaven, a place that they loved, a place where the social fabric was so important. And so almost every person said to us, yes, talk about occupation, talk about war, talk about the assaults, but also make sure people know what Gaza was beyond that as well. And they wanted people to know about the vibrancy in Gaza, the fact that Gaza has wonderful universities, that people were entrepreneurs, that there were social clubs, that there were artists, that there were poets. They wanted people to know about the physical beauty, the seaside, and just everyday life. People talked about things like riding in a service, like a shared taxi in Gaza City, and if you had just been to the market and picked up strawberries, like everyone in the service would get a strawberry and trying to taste the fruit. And this idea that that there was a sense of community all the time. And this isn't to over romanticize Gaza. Obviously, there were internal conflicts and many things within as well. But just the sense that there was pride in the place, and that there was life and vibrancy there, and that the nightmare that I think many people, especially in the West, and many well-meaning people associate with Gaza, was not the only part of it. It was not the only part of its history, and it wasn't inevitable either that Gaza would get to that kind of point.
Well, actually, sort of deviate from my script for a second. And in your interviews, does that feeling sustain into their view of the future at this point in time?
So I think talking with people now about the future is really difficult. Many people would say it was very difficult for them to envision anything beyond just the current day-to-day, especially when we were doing the interviews in 2024 in particular. Now when I speak with people, it's a mix of grief, a mix of fear, and a little bit of sense of just paralysis. People know that there are a lot of other forces kind of working around Gaza right now, but there is still resilience there. There is still agency there, and that is, to me, that's important to remember. And people know it is still there, a bit under the surface at the moment, while people are still just trying to get from one day to the next.
I mean, that's something I would add that I hope you all know is that the attention has shifted a little bit. The ceasefire, there is no ceasefire, okay? It is still going on. Not at the magnitude that forced public attention all this time, but it is still going on. So it really needs your attention. So I guess one question is, there's a whole bunch of books. I mean, one good thing, I suppose, silver lining about all this is that, Gaza's talked about so much more than it ever was before. And so we have a proliferation of books, more books out now than I've ever seen before, both, histories, and then you have things like my book and Most About Tohas that are personal. So what did you, with your book, what niche do you see it filling? What gap do you think your book fills?
Yeah, well, I will start by saying too, some people often ask when we started writing the book as well. And as many of you may remember, October 7th was on a Saturday, and it was that Monday, an editor I'd worked with before contacted me and pretty much said, we've wanted a book on Gaza for a while. We're definitely going to need one now. Are you or anyone interested? And at that point, Pam, I did a search, and of course there are many there are many books on Gaza, but I would say not as many as maybe at that point one would think. I think there are a plethora now. The first edition of your book, of course, was out. There were other kind of personal accounts and anthologies that were out, and there were one or two kind of key historical, kind of more scholarly texts. But there wasn't a lot just on Gaza that tried to kind of mix the historical narrative and kind of a, I guess one could say, slightly more like scholarly narrative with personal accounts and oral histories and things like this. So we tried to really blend those two approaches in our book and provide a history that was comprehensive, but maybe not quite as dense as some of the other ones that were out there, and also really infused with, again, these quotes, these pop outs, these testimonies from Gazans living in Gaza at different points in time, dating back from, kind of mid 20th century up through the present and what we've seen lately, and tried to kind of combine those two approaches.
How do you feel like one of the tensions I felt even when I was there all the time, but also in writing our book, et cetera, is separating Gaza from Palestine. Because one of the things I think Israel has tried to do, and fairly effectively, I think in some respects, is to separate it. So there is no Palestine; it's the West Bank and Gaza, and people treat it differently. So how do you feel about that? I mean, because I was always challenged a little bit on that as well by the people who live there, because they want to be seen as part of Palestine.
Well, as you know, Pam, most of my work has been in the West Bank, and so that's more of where I'm used to working and doing my writing from. But I do think, to some degree, a lot of people say that Gaza is sort of a microcosm of Palestine, that if you're going to understand Palestine, like, look to Gaza first. And I do think that was true for much of the history. And in our book, we do trace the history essentially from kind of right after World War I, the start of the British Mandate, up through really through last year. And I think really until 2005, I think that's a pretty accurate description, that Gaza is kind of microcosm of Palestine. But I would argue, and many Gazans I spoke with would say after 2005, the trajectories of Gaza and the West Bank do diverge significantly. 2005 is when Israel withdraws settlers, the settlements, and internal military presence from Gaza, obviously still maintaining control of Gaza's borders. But that made the situation in the Gaza Strip very different from the West Bank already. And then obviously the two different governments, essentially, with Hamas winning the 2006 elections, taking over the government in Gaza in 2007 till now, and the Palestinian Authority still in the West Bank. So I would say up till the last 20 years, I do think there are two different stories that are obviously the Palestinian story, but the lived reality on the ground in the West Bank and Gaza has been objectively different. And young people in particular, who don't have pre-2005 memories, are very aware that their reality has been very different from their Palestinian relatives and friends in the West Bank.
So Israel actually has been pretty effective from the beginning at separating them, because you're right, it's very, very different. I started my work in the West Bank as well. I guess this next question is a little bit hard for me to phrase right, but so my first trips in the West Bank, et cetera, I spent a lot of time going into Israel proper to trying to talk to Israelis. And whenever I tried to talk about the historical progression, we'd always get into it. What amazed me was, you could think of history as being facts that you can't refute, and I found that's not true. Because they have their own view of history. They have their own interpretation of history. And there's that. And there's also, depending on where you start, they can always quickly say, well, yes, but that's because they did this, So, I mean, how do you deal with that trap? Because, this business of I don't know if you've talked to Israelis at all about your history. And what do they come back to you with? But you ignored this, and they did this.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. I would say, I teach on the Israel-Palestine conflict in London. We take a kind of historical approach, and we do try and look at it through a narrative-based approach. Like, this is what an Israeli or Israeli-leaning narrative would say. This is what Palestinians would say, or Palestinian narrative. So for me, and when I teach, I say to my students, whether you agree with the other narrative or not, it's important to understand it and know it and read about it. So I would say to some degree we try and do that in the book. We do try and provide, again, a history that invites different types of readers into it. I did, in addition to interviewing many Gazans and Palestinians for the book, did also interview Israelis, especially those who were in communities attacked on October 7th, families at the Hostage and Missing Square in Tel Aviv. So those stories are also included in a chapter in the book, and kind of the Israeli take on different elements that are going on throughout Gaza's history is also included here. But you're right that the history is always contested on this conflict, and that is something that we tried not to shy away from, but try and introduce to the reader the different narratives around some of the events that we were talking about and some of the justifications that were offered, whether one agreed with those or not.
I mean, I can't really almost think of any other, correct me if I'm wrong, but when I think about other global issues, when you say history is contested, are there that many where you get this much debate over what history is supposed to be, right? Some established facts.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this conflict is notorious for a reason and being complex. I mean, as someone as I know you also, Pam, have lived in many different places, but I think I've lived in Northern Ireland, have worked in Central Africa, elsewhere, and I think each each place has its complexities for sure, and the stories that people that grow up with and become part of their historical narrative. I think that happens in a lot of places.
Yeah, when they do say what the victors own the story, so they tell the story, I think that's part of what these books are doing, right? Is trying to reclaim the story from the.
That's right, and I would say that's
Other point of
largely,
view.
again, I
Yeah.
think your book does that very well, and our book too, trying to, again, center Palestinian voices in the telling of Gaza's history for sure.
So you have a whole chapter on Hamas, and I will tell you that one of the toughest things when I first started working on the book on my book right after October 7th happened, and then it took a little longer to put together. But the number one, I don't know if you get it still as much now, but back then, before the genocide was as extreme as it got to be. The first question was, "Are you saying you support Hamas? You support October?" Because there's so many assumptions and stereotypes about Hamas, and I'm sort of wondering, what do you think? You sort of summarize for the audience here. Is there something? What do you think is the most misunderstood thing about Hamas, or the thing that people don't know?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Obviously, Hamas comes up in a lot of these conversations. And one thing we do in the book, we spend about kind of 2 chapters talking about Hamas's rise to power and then also how they governed after they were democratically elected in Gaza. So I will just first emphasize that Hamas did win the elections in 2006. Those elections were deemed free and fair. With that said, even going into October 2023, we have Barometer polling that some of my colleagues and friends were involved in doing, and Hamas was deeply unpopular going into October 2023, with over 60% of the population finding them either complete lack of trust or very little trust or faith in Hamas. So I do just want to emphasize that element. But Hamas, as an organization over the years and up through today, has many different facets. And is an organization with a lot of different faces, I guess one could say, and we try and talk about this in the book. Just briefly, Hamas emerged from the Muslim Brotherhood that had been active in Palestine, but that organization initially was very intentional about not getting involved in politics or not getting involved in resistance. This was kind of the PLO era, the more secular groups, and the Brotherhood kind of sat that out. And it wasn't really to the late 80s, the first Intifada, that Hamas emerges as a sort of offshoot from the Brotherhood and saying, we have to engage on this Palestine question now. So on the one hand, you still have the old, more Islamic social movement, the libraries, the clinics, the charitable arm. Going into the 90s, you have the armed resistance movement, mainly through the Al-Qassam brigades, which the US and other actors classify as a terrorist group pretty early on with their use of suicide bombing. And then you have the decision in the mid-2000s for Hamas to enter politics and run for office, which they do quite successfully with pretty much their first go. And so now you have the old social movement, the armed resistance movement, and then you have this governing body that needs to worry about things like collecting taxes and taking out the trash and things like that. So you have these different facets of Hamas, and you also have Hamas within the Gaza, within the West Bank, and the external leadership. And so when we talk about Hamas, I think as a block actor, there's a lot of different elements within it, and there's a lot of different leaders and actors who speak for Hamas in different contexts. So I do just try and emphasize that nature of the organization when we talk about Hamas as kind of a block institution.
I guess what I would add to that, so I spent a lot of time talking to the young people there about their attitudes toward the government. I think it's really important for people to realize there's Hamas, the government, and there's Hamas as the resistance. Personally, I don't think this war was about Hamas versus Israel. It was the resistance, because it wasn't just Hamas. I mean, there's other factions and they were involved too. And the people uniformly supported the resistance. All the young people I talked to support resistance. And Hamas as the resistance, they support. Then there's Hamas, the government. And to be honest with you, just to be fair, a lot of their complaints about Hamas was complaints about government. Like, who likes being taxed, right? It was complaints like that. Because the problem was that Hamas couldn't raise revenue through normal means because not even allowed to export, et cetera. So, of course, they were actually charging taxes that were higher than most people could comfortably do. But a lot of their complaints were things that, like, we all have about our own government. They didn't like the taxes. The other thing people don't realize is some of the things that I didn't like either. Like when I was there, they came up for a while. There was this rule that women couldn't smoke shisha, the water pipes. And of course I did. And I'm like, but what people don't realize is that was done in part when you hear these strict rules coming out and people think it's because they're against women, et cetera, is there's also these other groups within Gaza called the Salafis. I don't know if you get into that at all, but they're much more conservative and scary than Hamas. And there's some things Hamas had to do to pacify the Salafis. Because if they didn't, they would have unrest and civil war. So they were trying to balance. So sometimes they did things as like basically dog bones. There's something to give them. Now I'm not to say that they weren't really conservative, et cetera, but I'm just saying it's not as black and white as people think. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I would add to that. I would say in our conversations, many people felt that what they had voted for Hamas to do, they had voted for change from what they saw as the corruption, the ossification of the Palestinian Authority. And many felt that by 2023, Hamas had fallen into many of those same patterns, and at least in our conversations. And I would say too, most people would not refute the right to armed resistance, but many people said to us in our interviews, October 7th was a mistake. The society was not prepared. Hamas was willing to do this kind of at the expense of the society, and that's just what we heard from our interviewees.
I guess, but
not to a person, but many.
And I was one comment, won't dwell on this. So when I found the young people, what they said about that changed over time. Initially, did you talk to people right after October 7th? I got to tell you, they were, don't interpret this the wrong way, okay? They were thrilled. No, really, because here's a people who had been, they never, this is downtrodden people that, their pride was again and again stomped on. They could never stand up for themselves. And I got to tell you, when I was living there, we did nonviolent protests all the time. We never got attention, never. They were going to the ICC, et cetera. Nothing worked. So to finally see somebody stand up, because listen, I want to remind people, this country is not nonviolent. Think about what this country does every time we think anything is done wrong to us, even when nothing is done wrong. So this may be an unpopular point of view, but they felt some pride at first. Oh, finally we're standing up. And wow, we're capable of doing that. They thought that they were hopeless, I'm serious. So now that changed, obviously, over time, because then the price became really, really significant, and it it snowballed. And actually, well, I could go on and on about that, but it's just, I think the real lesson from all this is just complexities into this. And if the press and everybody keeps trying to make it black and white.
Yeah, and just on the note of press too, I would say there was a lot of different types of information that 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 Gazans were reading versus what Israelis were reading about the scale and type of suffering on the other side, if you will, with you know, a lot of downplaying of the civilian suffering and just the idea that civilians were not affected to the same degree. And I would say, you know, these reports and the accounts of what happened, I think, just like anywhere, different people had different responses to it. But we did just numerically, I mean, you can see this in polling that that right after October 7th, the response was different than it was, say, you know, some months after, as the as what that led to became quite clear.
Because also Hamas was this is right at the point when there was talk of Saudi Arabia normalizing with Israel, et cetera, and Hamas saw that the whole resistance project could, like, what leverage would they have? So you can argue about that, but anyway, what would you say that, what would be the dominant message that you would want people to take? What do you hope that people will take from this book, or you can give more than one?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, again, the what's encapsulated in this title of The Dream and the Nightmare, of recognizing Gaza as a place that did have these many different facets, that did have these different opinions, but most of all was a place that, again, had this vibrancy that existed before the last years, that existed very much in full prior to the Nakba and before 1948. I mean, Gaza City was a hub type of urban center for not just decades or centuries, but literally for millennia. Like, you can read about Gaza, it's referenced in the Bible, it's referenced in ancient texts, and it was, you know, a city of great life for so long. And I would say the course of the 20th century changes that tremendously, you know, even before we get to 2023. But that sense of life in the strip is still comes through even today. And I might just read a couple kind of quotes for from people who had the chance to speak with that highlight some of this. And I'll start with one that that I think just encapsulates this spirit, and this is from Allah, who's a young guy in his late 20s, and he says, "People in Gaza, they like to live life. They know the value of it. The people of Gaza are missing many basic things like food, electricity, a good life, and we value these things very much. People know exactly the meaning of having a hot meal to eat, the meaning of having a family. People are just trying to continue life with what they have. Regardless of the situation and what is happening, they're just trying to pass their tragedies and sorrows. They're just trying to live." And we almost end the book on that quote, which I think is, for me, what I hope people do take away after reading some of the historical quotes and accounts, which I can read a little bit more of if...
You know, and what I like about what he says is, so I would have lived in Gaza longer, except that Israel deported and banned me for life. And really suddenly, I had gone out to visit my family and was on the way back in. And I still don't know if these are the police, the border guard, whatever, were waiting for me. And I was arrested and then deported home. And at that point, I had a home there, you know, and I couldn't go back. And what was amazing to me when I ended up back in the States, not intending to be here, no health insurance, no job, I found this to be a very cold place, I gotta tell you. But and I kept thinking to myself as I listened to people, is we don't know the meaning of life. I mean, what was so lovely about living in Gaza is partly because of what they lived under. They do, you know, they savor everything, and it made life so much richer. And they took care. I was so different. I'm not a Muslim, et cetera, and yet I had no family members, but I felt taken care of. I do not feel taken care of here.
So if we have time, I might share one or two more quotes that kind of show this dichotomy of the dream and the nightmare. And I'll read some of the more recent ones, since I know people are kind of interested in this time period. And this is from our friend Ibrahim, who was from Jabalia camp in the north and was living in the north in October 2023 when the evacuation orders first started. So he says, I was living in the north of Gaza. They told people to move to the south. There was a discussion in my family between me and my siblings. Should we leave or should we stay? I said we should leave, that this time was not like the other times. I could hear from the Israeli speech that this time they would try to destroy everything. I had my wife and 2 kids, so I said, we need to move to the south. And I left to the south with more than 45 people, brothers, sisters, kids, nieces, nephews. It was a big challenge. Where to move? How to move? Are you going to stay together? What is the right strategy? Should you stay together so the whole family is destroyed in one hit? Or should you travel in clusters so if one place is hit, the others manage to survive? And then your brain is overflowing with information and news that that family is killed, that neighborhood is gone, that clinic, that building. And you have all these feelings. Is this the last gathering? The last time to see my neighborhood? The last time to see my kids? All these things are in your mind. You are leaving your home to nowhere. You sleep in the street, a car, a classroom, a clinic, a tent, a hospital. You have nowhere, literally nowhere to go.
Where is he now? Do you know?
He ended up evacuating and is currently in Canada, but is trying to get back to Gaza if or when Rafah opens for any kind of real passage.
Would you say most of your people how many did you interview in total?
About 30 people.
And would you say most of them are still in Gaza now or most out?
It's a mix, more out because the interviews that we could do were mostly people who had been able to get out to Cairo in the first 6 months. When Rafah was still open, some people were able to leave, but even that was extremely difficult. People had to pay $5,000 per adult and $2,500 per child to even have a chance to exit. And even then, it was kind of like a lottery. And so people would spend their whole life savings or rely on GoFundMes. And we have some quotes from Gazans living in Cairo and how the guilt that they felt about leaving other family members behind, especially elderly people who couldn't make the journey. And I just wanted to say about Ibrahim's quote, this idea of does the family stay together or travel in small groups, that was echoed in multiple interviews that we had with people. That was a choice that many families had to make. And for Ibrahim and his family, he went on to tell us that between him and his wife's family, over 100 people were killed. He's very clear in what he says to us, like that no one had links to Hamas. These were people that he said even Israel would have called quote unquote collateral damage, that they just lived in houses that were nearby to the houses that were targeted. But because the explosives and missiles were so big, the neighboring houses were destroyed as well. And he said, this is what happened to our family and to everyone. I do just want to read another quote from Ibrahim. And again, he has had this, horrific account and he tells us a bit more about that. But he was also involved in trying to set up some of the community kitchens and places where food could be accessed by Gazans when they were displaced. And he had worked with NGOs and had some contacts. He was able to do this. So he's talking about this, and he says, when you speak about the community kitchen, you need a big pot to cook in, and you need to put it up high. And you need to be a good garbage collector to collect papers and bags to build a fire underneath it. Then you need to buy ingredients, like for mujadara. You need to find bags of lentils and rice, or you work with whatever is available in the markets. Then you get families nearby to help in preparing the food. You couldn't always buy ingredients anymore, so then I'd try and coordinate with people I knew. So we were establishing these initiatives, and everyone was a volunteer, people cooking the food, people distributing it. So the level of solidarity was very high. I was engaged in these things, and I was happy that I could help people. I feel proud of my people. Some people need a leader, but others are inspired by the needs of others and the social solidarity and cooperation. During a crisis, you can hear the sense of we, of us. That's human nature. We can't say we Gazans are a society of angels. You have bad people and good people. But in a crisis, we adopt that we perspective, and you can see the stories of solidarity and sharing. It's not just sharing pain, because pain was for everyone, but also sharing food and supplies. I have seen all these things. And I really like that account from Ibrahim, and it echoes quotes earlier from him in the book when he's talking about being a young person in the first Intifada. He's arrested then, like many young men were, but also talks about that social solidarity and the sense that even in these hard times, people watch out for each other, shared anything that they did have. And so we kind of hear him echoing that dichotomy throughout the book, again, of that sense of these atrocities, but also this sense of pride and hope at the same time, and the sense of community.
One follow-up question before you open it up. Have any of the, I've heard some reports, both myself and I've read about, as the genocide wore on, some of the social fabric that he talks about, people helping each other, et cetera, starting to fray and fall apart. Did you hear any of that?
We did, actually. And so I don't want to sugarcoat things too much, especially in the last year and over the summer of 2025, when, as I'm sure people here are aware, there were famine conditions, starvation, when people literally could not get food. Then I would say it became much more difficult to maintain that social side, because it was such a survival instinct, and anything that people could get for themselves or their families had to be kind of seized upon. So I would say that became more difficult to sustain as it went on, but was still notable to us how far, how long that sense of solidarity did last, really as long as it could, before it became simply for survival, that people needed to prioritize themselves more.
And also, how many of them would still say they hope to go back someday to Gaza?
Most people that I speak with are still hopeful of that, and I would point out, whether in the diaspora or within Gaza itself, as we were talking about before, a very highly educated population, people who are trained as planners, as architects, as builders, as all the things that are going to be needed in Gaza's reconstruction. And many professionals are very keen to be part of that. And Gazans are, already offering different kinds of initiatives, plans, things like that. So we obviously hear a lot about the Board of Peace, about, kind of more external top-down models, but there's so much within Gaza, from the Gazan diaspora, of things that people are envisioning for themselves that are much closer to Gazans' interests.
And that's my greatest fear, actually, because when I hear about the Peace Board being talked about, whatever, I don't see those individuals being included.
No, not at all. I mean, I think people are aware there's no Palestinian representation on the board, and the Palestinian technical or technocratic committee is not even within Gaza yet. So,
we open it up. Did people in the audience have questions?
Here's the microphone. They get behind me.
Oh, okay. All right, go ahead.
That's how we do it. So a comment and 3 very quick questions. The comment is, it seems like it's always the civilians that suffer in conflicts, whether it's Ukraine or Sudan or Gaza. And you've told those stories very eloquently. My questions are really quick. Is there any separation between what Hamas wants vis-a-vis the existence of Israel and Gazans, the ordinary people? Question 1. Question 2 is, this is not exactly on topic, but what if Yasser Arafat had said yes to Bill Clinton in 2000, the offer that was on the table? Why did he walk away from that? And wouldn't that have been a lot better than what they have now? And the third one is, would they vote for a technocratic government, somebody that wasn't heavily involved in history and revenge? Do they just, I assume they want day-to-day, they want peace, safety, education, clean water. All these educated people could come back and provide that. Is there any chance that that could happen? Would they accept that?
Wow, thank you. A lot to cover. I'll say just briefly, the Camp David II offer. There has been a lot written in hindsight about that I think is important to look at, in the sense that the offer was not nearly as generous, I think, as it sometimes is portrayed. Maybe in percentages, it went further than it had in the past, but it was still a West Bank that was very fragmented and would have been very difficult to accept as any kind of cohesive state, and that's even more fragmented today by the just acceleration of the settlement. So I would say it would have been a very difficult deal for Arafat at that point to accept, in my opinion. In terms of what people want now, people that I speak with anyway are very keen for a different political future for Palestine. I mean, the Palestinian Authority is in dismal approval ratings, and literally single digits for Abu Mazen. When you talk to people, when you look at polling, people want to change from both Hamas and the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority. They want something new. Unfortunately, Israel is not really is not really allowing for that kind of new political leadership to emerge or arise. And also, quite frankly, the Palestinian Authority is not allowing for those types of movements to emerge right now either. And people are very aware of that and very critical of that. So yes, there is the will for that. Yes, there are many young, new people, a lot of new energy, I think, but they're very much constrained right now in this moment. And I think for what people want next, again, it's very varied, but there is a sense that, the old models, the way we've been talking about things are outdated in a way, and the sense that there needs to be new types of vision for what comes next. And for people that I speak with anyway, they don't feel that Hamas is providing that vision either, and they're very keen for some new kinds of ways of talking about Palestinian nationhood, Palestinian liberation, and exploring new types of models. And there are new models being talked about right now. And again, I would say they have varying support from different people, and that's that's what we would expect, I think, right now. But the conversations are just starting as we emerge from the horrors of the last 2 years.
And then the view of the average Gazan toward the state of Israel existing. I mean, is there any feelings that Israel has a right to exist?
So Pam can speak to her conversations too. I would say there's a pragmatism from a lot of people, and even from within Hamas, there are pragmatists within that who won't ideologically support the idea of a state of Israel, but are very aware that Israel is not going away and that there needs to be a way to think with that reality. And I have other friends, contacts who are very fine and say, look, neither people is going to leave. We need to learn a way forward, whether it's, a land for all, whether it's one state, whether it's two state, this just needs to be, we can't keep thinking in kind of the very old school way, what many would say is a more outdated way of complete liberation, but others, I would say, are even more doubling down on complete liberation. So it really just depends on who you speak with, but there are a lot of pragmatists in both Gaza and the West Bank.
But I guess I'm a little concerned. Israel doesn't believe in Palestinians' right to exist. I mean, look at polls of Israelis still. People seem overly concerned about why Palestinians. I mean, there seems to be an over concern about why Palestinians don't want Israel to exist. Well, first off, that's sort of a moot point. It does exist. It has way more power than they do. But what about an equal attention on, what does the average Israeli think? Do they think Palestinians have a right to exist? That's important too. And we need to look at both questions. And what disturbs me is that most of the polls I've seen of Israelis, there's still a pretty high resistance to Palestinians' right to any kind of self-determination. I will say that I found a lot of Palestinians when I lived there, and still when I talk to them, that would support one state, equal rights for everybody. And that's something that's a non-starter in Israel, which to me is, I don't think two states are possible at this point. I don't. The other thing I just want to say about this whole business about what kind of government, I think the most important issue we should be focusing on is not that. It's we've touched on this, letting Palestinians have some say in that. Right now, the way we're going, they're going to be told, they're going to be dictated what kind of government they have. I guarantee you that there's something that I work in called citizens' assemblies, Now, Gaza is usually in developed societies, and they're so at survival mode right now. It's hard to picture this, but if you were to have, if you made sure they were safe and they have food and shelter, and then brought them together into a citizens' assembly, they have plenty of opinions of what would work. But right now, I can't envision they're going to be dictated to. And that's what I think we should be focused on, making sure they're involved in that.
Thank you for an interesting discussion. I have one question about the past and one about the future. And the past is essentially the Israeli viewpoint, not mine, which is that they vacated Gaza voluntarily in 2005 after they had occupied it during the Six-Day War, right? And what has Hamas been up to? Now, you did mention Hamas, the resistance versus Hamas, the government. And Israel says all Hamas did was build tunnels. They did nothing else. So I wanted your view on that. What is the truth? You did mention that the Hamas were very unpopular just before October 7th. So what is the reason for that? And the question about the future is about the two-state solution. If that ever happens, there's a general viewpoint in the BBC, Al Jazeera and all, that the most appropriate person to represent the Palestinians would be Marwan Barghouti, who is in jail in Israel. So those are the two questions.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I would say, right, for the future, you're right. I think there are many different leaders, I think, who could lead Palestine well, but Marwan Barghouti is the one that is most voiced. He has been in Israeli prison since 2004, I believe, and is often kind of likened to a Palestinian Mandela. I have mixed feelings about that comparison, but I would just say, like, he is someone who most people I know say they could see as a potential leader, but he is one that that Israel is not looking to release, largely because of that. And I would again emphasize the PA also has kind of quietly also lobbied for him not to be released because they are aware of how strong and powerful he could be in terms of displacing current leadership. So you have a lot of constraints on that. But yes, someone like Barghouti is someone who has in the past kind of spoken to both Fatah and Hamas supporters. He's done a lot in prison to try and unite the parties around reconciliation, and has, kind of said that he would be supportive of a kind of two-state model or some kind of self-determination in that regard. So yes, just to say he's an extremely important person to watch right now, but it's also much older and also quite the last photos that we saw of him, he looked like he had been not treated well in prison these last several years. For the past, I would say, yeah, I mean, Israel's disengagement in 2005. Many Israelis I spoke would say, "Look, we withdrew, we gave them a chance in Gaza, and look what they did. They elected Hamas. They did the rockets, they did the tunnels, and then October 7th. So why should we kind of trust this actor?" And I think what we try and unpack in the book is that withdrawal was a bit more complicated than that. There was different motivations for it, partly to kind of separate the West Bank and Gaza, partly to kind of freeze the peace process. And also, at the time of the disengagement, no one knew that Hamas was going to come into power, and so there were things within Gaza that changed in ways that couldn't have been foreseen then also. But certainly from an Israeli perspective, people do point to that as kind of the opportunity moment that was somewhat lost, whereas Palestinians would say, look, Israel made it absolutely impossible for Hamas or any actor to govern Gaza effectively by completely sealing the borders, by imposing what was then called a siege that pretty much blocked and controlled all the goods that came in and out of the strip. So, two very different readings of that disengagement and the motives behind it.
I would say there's another opportunity that was hugely lost. There's an article that appeared in April 2007 in Vanity Fair. I suggest that you all read it. It's called Gaza Bombshell. And what people do not realize is that during the elections, you had moderates within Hamas who agreed to engage in a democratic exercise. They ran for office. That's what the U.S. wanted them to do. But you know what happened to those Hamas leaders who ran for office? And a lot of them ended up in Israeli prisons. The moderates ended up in prison, and a lot of them are still there to this day. So I think we lost an opportunity. In fact, Condoleezza Rice traveled over to and told the Fatah leaders that if they were to engage with Hamas because they had legitimately won control of their version of the Congress, they'd lose all U.S. aid. So there was an opportunity we lost. There were moderates who engaged in elections, and we could have worked with them. Instead, they were frozen out, put in prison, and so who was left?
Just wanted to ask a quick question about the Board of Peace. I think you've already hinted that it's going to come to no good because there's no Palestinian representation. Is that your view generally?
I mean, my analysis is that any body that's trying to work on Gaza and does not have Palestinian representation is not legitimate and is not going to be able to have the best interests of Palestinians or Gazans at heart.
So it's simply Trump's grandiose dream, one of his many grandiose dreams.
It appears that way up till now, anyway. Yes.
Thank you.
I'm a Palestinian, okay, but I came here in the 50s. And, I think your point about Gaza, all this and that, but I think, it's not a complicated problem. It's a very clear problem. You have people who are dispossessed, okay, people who are displaced, either made refugees or the fifth column living inside Israel, and then after 67, under this horrible occupation of 58 years. As an American, it's like the African-American experience. We've always got to start, we did this and that and that and that. And like the African-Americans, we've had groups from the Black Panthers to the Black Muslims to Roy Wilkins to whoever it was. All we want is freedom. We're tired. I tell you, I don't care about religion. I happen to be a Palestinian Christian, okay? And I just want to make one more statement. The first time I visited the West Bank, I had left when I was 5. When I was 23, it's the first time I saw a military occupation. Because I left in the 50s, I missed the 67 war. I saw people living in patrol checkpoints. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I said, no American would tolerate this. But it doesn't get out. So, I hope your book will at least explain that the harsh realities of day-to-day life. But my question is to you, that what I heard, Hamas was an Israeli creation. Palestinians were meeting with Jim Baker and George Herbert Walker Bush, and the Palestinian representatives told him, he said, Hamas. He goes, Mr. President, I want to tell you, the Israelis don't like the PLO, they don't like the secular movement, and they encourage the rise of Hamas. So these things, and then about Gazans and West Bankers, we're all Palestinians. We're all Palestinians. And most of Gaza all came from 48 Palestine. And I encourage you to read a New Yorker article published in 1957 by the New Yorker correspondent who visited Gaza, a letter from Gaza. He said, you know what? I can't believe that the contradictions. We have people coming from 8,000 miles away to live, while people from villages 8 miles from home can't go back. Because what a contradiction.
Great, thank you. Yes, I would just underscore much of what you said and just say in the book we do talk a lot about the Nakba generation, the fact that over 70% of Gazans are either direct Nakba survivors or their descendants. The population of Gaza nearly tripled in 1948 because of refugees who were forcibly displaced during the Nakba. I'm trying to come back to the question, but I everything that you said I completely appreciate, and I think everything you communicated, the realities of the occupation are things we try and bring out in the book. One of my friends talks about his father trying to take them back to see their house where they had been displaced from that's very close to the Gaza border and what's now Israel. He talks about, I'm going to work on a flower farm there as a day laborer in the 1980s when Gazans were able to do that, and just the indignity of working on what was his family's land for for an Israeli company. And so we do try and tell those stories, and I hope those come out. But I think the way you said them was very effective for people here. Thank you.
I want to underscore something else you said. No American. I mean, when I was living there, I used to say, I put any American, make them live there for 3 months. They'll be fighting back, So be careful before you judge. When people are, there's actually a line in the new Jim Crow book. Again, it's parallel to African Americans, where she says, when you put people into like a ghetto and you treat them like animals, and we're surprised about the consequences, we think that they're going to come out and act like model citizens. No, the things that we see happening are a result of that.
I grew up in Connecticut. I used to go from Connecticut to New York to drink because they had an 18-year-old drinking, 21. They had 18, and Connecticut was 21. So there were no border control. I couldn't believe the borders. All of a sudden, I said the first time when I go to the Middle East, I said, "Geez, I can't cross the border. I can't leave the town." It's unbelievable.
Thank you. Thank you for the very insightful discussion. My question was on the perception or the opinion of the Gazan people and Palestinians in general on the current ICJ proceedings, South Africa v. Israel. We know that victims are not a unitary actor and that reparations for them may take very different forms, and the priorities may be different, especially in the midst of a potential reconstruction of the territory. So I was wondering what their perception is on this, knowing that we already have, for example, the Wall Advisory Opinion and that recognize the legality of what was happening in the territory. Does it even matter that we attribute a legal category to what happened to the Gazan people?
Great, thank you so much for the question. I think as you alluded to in your question, yes, people obviously were supportive of the case, obviously supportive of the allegation of genocide that was brought by that South Africa raised quite early in January 2024, but also a lot of frustration, disillusionment, disappointment with international law, with international institutions, with the international community, that even despite court cases like that or the ICC warrants, that nothing changed on the ground, or that the processes of these court cases takes years and years. And so I would say it was a bit of a dual response to that. And I would say to the protests around the world, and I would say protests here in the US in particular, with people I spoke with, were very noticed. The fact that public opinion in the US and on US college campuses was unlike anything people had seen in Palestine's history. That was noted, and that was recognized quite positively, I would say. So for people involved in solidarity things here, that was seen and very much appreciated.
I think they're also puzzled, and I have to admit I'm puzzled too sometimes about why that hasn't resulted in any change. It's like you see the protests and you want to think that something will change now.
Yeah, and I think there's a time element here too, right? The fact that there were very generational splits in how people viewed the last 2 years, how they view Palestine, and we see both parties now really grappling with this question in a way that they haven't ever before. And so for me and others, that's a sense that in 5, 10, this is long timelines for people on the ground, but the sense that for U.S. policy, I do think things will be on a slightly different trajectory than they've been in the past, and that's largely because people have spoken out.
It's sad though that I had, in my book, which is a collection of stories, 5 of the authors are in the U.S., and we just did the publicity tour, and they were all too afraid to speak out. So here they wrote in the book, and because they're all here on visas. And Trump is saying, at that time he could take them away, and I thought that's and that's something I never thought would happen. I never thought we'd get to that point.
Hello. So I just want to say, as an American, I feel kind of complicit and also helping this situation as a taxpayer. When you don't really get to decide where your tax dollars go 100%. That being said, I can't help but to see when you see what if you were to take an American over to Gaza right now and they'd fight back? I'm seeing that on our own soil right now with what's happening in Minneapolis. But I do want to ask, when it comes to funding, like with our quote unquote allies, when it comes to the Palestinians, I feel like their funding is non-existent, and I just wanted to kind of get your take on that, because I feel like the David and Goliath story is a little kind of mixed up in this situation. It's very confusing.
Yes, thank you. I mean, obviously, there's been much asymmetry in this conflict, and certainly in terms of funding and funding from the U.S. in particular. And again, this isn't just since 2023, as you probably know. Much of it dates back essentially to the first Camp David Accords back in 1980 and 1979, where the U.S. committed very high levels of both military and other forms of economic aid to Israel. That continues. There is some support for the Palestinian Authority, also from the U.S. and from European channels, but I don't have the percentage on the top of my mind, but it's it's a fraction of what's given to Israel, and it's certainly not given for arms or anything in that category. It's for institutions or sometimes for humanitarian aid, and again, even those are often either paused or after the Hamas elections completely kind of stopped, and so that disparity continues very much until now.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Norman. Look forward to reading the book and how it reflects your decades of scholarship and also on the ground work in this area. I'm curious for you to speak from your professor hat as well, and how you're helping students understand these conflicts, well, this conflict in particular, but just conflict in general as part of your role at UCL.
Oh gosh, great, thank you. So I teach in London at University College London. I teach a course on Israel-Palestine. I teach another class on just international conflict. I run kind of this Israel-Palestine initiative, trying to have different types of spaces and different types of speakers for students to come and kind of learn or talk about what's going on. And really for students, I would kind of say where we started, we look at different narratives and trying to understand not just facts, but how people have felt and lived this conflict, how they interpret it, and the different lenses. And then again, that sense that even if you don't agree with the other person, like trying to understand their point of view is so essential for ever making progress on this issue. But really, I try and let students find their own way. I mean, a lot of students have their own approaches, which I respect. And just at this point, I would say, like, I think students get a lot of bad rap in like media and stuff. And I always tell them I'm so proud of them. It's even when, no matter what their particular tactic is, it's very clear they're a very caring generation, and they really want to change things and make things better. And so I really try and nurture that spirit in them and try and guide them with some of the learning that can inform those efforts.
Have there been the kind of campus crackdowns on free speech on this issue in the UK, like there have been here?
There are some crackdowns, not nearly as intense as they were here in the U.S. And partly is just when they happen, partly is the nature of the protests, and partly is just that the space over there to talk about Palestine is much different, I would say, than it is in the U.S. It's a lot easier, I would say, to be open about Palestine in general. But again, I would say my Palestinian colleagues and students still feel quite also compromised and worried about being public. But I would say in general, there's a bit more space to talk about Palestine overseas.
Yeah. So my question to you is, when we have these conversations, I can't help but think about Charlie D'Agata, who's a CBS senior correspondent. And when he was covering Ukraine, he basically said, we have to have sympathy for the people of Ukraine because they are a European society. And I feel as a Palestinian, and also you being an academic, journalist, we're constantly trying to have a burden of proof. And every time despite all the documentation, despite the rich literature of Palestinians, we're always being met with our credentials being questioned, historical facts being biased. And I guess, how much documentation, how much academia do we need to combat, quite simply, these anti-Arab Palestinian rhetoric that the West has been regurgitating for God knows how long. What would be your answer to that? Yeah.
Yeah, I would say you shouldn't need it at all, right? There shouldn't need to be me, a non-Palestinian person up here writing a book for people to like pay attention and listen. I would say one thing, even though we couldn't go to Gaza in these last 2 years while writing the book, and no researchers or international journalists really could, Gazans were getting the story out. Like you didn't need people like me there, taking pictures or something like that, because Gazans were getting those pictures out and telling those stories and letting the world know what was happening there. And that to me that's what galvanized protests. That's what moved people to take action in these last years. That's what got people actually paying attention. And so I would say yes, I can play my role with the identity I have and the platforms and privilege that I have, but Gazans and Palestinians are telling their own stories, and I do think people are starting to listen in a way that maybe they haven't in the past, and it's long overdue. But it's those stories are out there, and people are just it's whether one engages in them. That's that's the choice for people. But I do see that happening now.
And maybe your last question.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really for me it's intense. I mean, I'm from a Lebanese background. So two questions. Why do you think Israel is trying so hard, I guess, to get rid of UNRWA? And the second one is, I don't know if I detected some note of optimism from you regarding the direction where the West, I guess, might be headed, especially the U.S., I guess, in regards to, the Palestinian-Israel question, especially given the silencing, the really hard silencing of any pro-Palestinian voices in academia, in the media, social media, I mean, everywhere.
Yeah, thank you. So the UNRWA question first, a big one. And again, for Israel, there was opposition to UNRWA well before October 7th, viewing it as an organization that kind of preserved the right of return, that preserved a lot of the ideas of Palestinian nationalism and Palestinian refugee movements in particular. And then after October 7th, there were the reports from within Israel of a handful of UNRWA employees involved in the October 7th attacks, which was, very that was huge within Israel. And then when hostages started being released and people reported, being held in either UNRWA hospitals or schools or underneath them in tunnels. And so for all of those reasons within Israel, this idea of just UNRWA needing to be completely not involved in any of the humanitarian aid, things like that, became quite a focus. Obviously, within Gaza, within Palestinian society, within the 70,000 plus UNRWA employees, many who I know and greatly respect their work. I mean, they are providing historically always so much of the food aid, so much of the education, which is key, running the schools, so much of the medical aid and running the clinics, and have the apparatuses and the systems in place to be able to deliver resources effectively. So to me, it's an extreme, it's extremely damaging to try and limit UNRWA's activities. I would say right now they are still operating locally within Gaza and have started running schools again and have started opening clinics again, but they are not allowed to be involved in any of the goods coming in and out. Those have all been literally plastered, literally things like removed the UNRWA branding. So I think that will remain controversial. For looking ahead, yeah, I mean, I would say so cautiously, optimistic is even too strong of a term, I would say, but just the sense that things will not be the same again as they were pre-2023 in so many ways. But I think especially for the biggest shift for me here is in the US, where I live in London now, but I grew up here and everything. And I do see just a very different type of conversation starting to happen here. Again, it's more at the popular level, at the grassroots level. It'll take a while for it to move up to the elite level. But you have again, a whole population across both major parties that feel very differently about this conflict than their parents or their grandparents did. And I do think that is something that's going to continue and shift things in a different direction in the future.
I want to make an observation. I think it's true, and think about it. What brought that about? What brought that shift about? I mean, it was, to me, and this has happened over and over again, every time you see a big shift in public opinion and a lot of debate, whatever, it's when violence happens. It's when Israel, strikes back in a way that's and to be honest with you, I mean, when I talk to people I know within Hamas, that was part of the calculus. Now, I will tell you that and again, these deep side things are very unpopular, but I'm going to say it anyway. The whole, they didn't intend that whole concert that was there, that they didn't know that would be there. It was a whole different thing, but they realized that this is the only way, and this is where I think the blame shifts to us. If we didn't want this violence to occur, then we should have shown them that this kind of change was possible without it. Because it was at huge cost, probably too much cost, but that's what the calculus was, is they had to somehow get people's attention again and provoke Israel to showing its true face.
Yeah, and I guess I would counter that a little bit and just say, I in no way would ever want to be seen as an apologist for October 7th or for what Hamas did. And
we still have to say that.
But I don't. Yeah. I mean, I don't feel like I need to say. I want to say that because we can. I can be someone who works on Palestine, talks about the history, tries to look at Hamas as a rational actor, but still say that that myself and many people I know were horrified by what happened.
But I guess I would say it's our fault. I think it's the international community's fault that October 7th happened, because if we had, if real change. Think about, was there any really significant, when did the Palestinians get anything? They've given up and given up and given up. And that's one reason why Fatah lost. Hamas doesn't have support, neither does Fatah, because they kept giving up and giving up and got nothing. So to me, the real blame for, I agree with you. I didn't want October 7th either. I'm a nonviolent. But the real blame, I think, for October 7th is on the international community, because if we had shown them that significant change could happen, without that, it would never have happened.
Well, I know we're almost out of time, but I'll just say, I do think there's an onus on the international community now to start doing things in a very different way. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that in any way, shape, or form with, again, with the Board of Peace. But that doesn't mean the work has stopped for those of us on the ground trying to do things in a different way, trying to pressure our leaders and policymakers to do things different. So thank you.
And on that note, let's give a round of applause for Dr. Norman and Pam Bailey.